Hi, my name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, or TPhGames as my little games channel here is called, and today I want to look into Lords of the Fallen, the 2023 remake that came out just recently, and want to give you my first impressions of the game. I have not completed it yet, so that is why it's just my first impressions and not a full review, but I'm 10 hours into the game and feel like talking about it, so I decided to make this video even though I'm a bit late to the party, to be honest. This game here, Lords of the Fallen from 2023, is the reboot of Lords of the Fallen from 2014, just to make things a little bit more confusing for everyone. And the original game was not that well received. The developers, Deck 13, later made The Surge 1 and 2, and recently Atlas Fall, I think it's called. So they went on a different path. And this game was originally planned, as far as I'm aware, as Lords of the Fallen 2, so as a sequel to the first game. And it was planned to release in 2017, but it never came out. And then development studios were changed over the years, back and forth. It was kind of in development hell, and then it became a reboot of the series, and now we got Lords of the Fallen 2023, or whatever you want to call it. Usually when a game is in development hell like this, the probability of it turning out to be absolutely awful is very high. But interestingly, I have to admit, what they delivered here is actually pretty decent in many ways, though it's definitely far from perfect. And this is basically already, in a weird sense, my final verdict of the game, so thank you for watching, see you next time, press the like button and subscribe. But if you're interested in exploring what the weaknesses of this game are, then maybe stay a while and listen, because that is kind of interesting. First of all, this game is a Soulslike and heavily inspired by the FromSoft Souls games and friends. It's also interesting from a, let's call it, game historic perspective, because Lords of the Fallen from 2014 was pretty much one of the very first Souls-likes that came out that were not made by FromSoft and tried to give us more entries in this subgenre. Some would call it clones or Souls clones, but the term clone is so negative in my opinion. But on the other side, it's so common to have more iterations or more titles. Think of roguelikes and roguelites. Think of Metroidvanias and so on, Dota-likes, even though you would call them MOBAs and so on. It's very common that you have multiple entries in a subgenre, so just call it a clone is, in my opinion, a little bit simplifying. Especially in these subgenres, you have often very narrow definitions, and we maybe come to that in a moment as well, what makes a Souls-like a Souls-like. However, what I find fascinating is that as inspiration, Lords of the Fallen from 2014 only had Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1 and to some degree Dark Souls 2, which also came out 2014 in March, while Lords of the Fallen came out in October. Now, Lords of the Fallen from 2023 had more games to take inspiration from, and of course the Souls-like genre also developed a bit further. They had just the FromSoft games. We had Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro if you would count that, and also Elden Ring. And if you play the game, you definitely notice, oh, that is from Dark Souls 1. Oh, that's Dark Souls 3. That's Bloodborne. Oh, and that is from Sekiro. It's very interesting to see that this game really takes some inspirations from those games and takes some mechanics. But it also adds its own ideas and mixes this into all of this. And this creates, in my opinion, a relatively decent game. What I find very unusual is that, considering how popular FromSoft's Souls games and friends are, there are not that many very good 3D Souls-likes out there. In 2D space we have quite a few, like for example Hollow Knight and so on, but in 3D space I can only think of a few, like for example for sure Nioh 1 and Nioh 2 as very good examples, also with a very different twist compared to what Dark Souls is doing. Then you could argue that Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor are also Souls-like, though they have also other elements mixed in. I would also call them like kind of Metroidvanias, if that makes sense, but they for sure also have the classic Souls mechanics in them. Then we have something like Mortal Shell, Remnant from the Ashes and stuff like that. So there are definitely some other good ones, or decent ones at least, out there, but it's, in my opinion, surprisingly few. I would have expected many more, and even getting close to the kind of quality of the FromSoft Souls games, and maybe even surpassing them. That is not what we are seeing. A lot of games tried, and many games failed, and some could kind of hold up against the Souls series like Neo, and that is basically already the exception to it. And this also works a lot because it's so different from Dark Souls in so many ways, and this kind of adds a new flavor to the whole genre, which I think is a very smart approach by the people making the Neo games. And you have to consider that especially Demon's Souls, but also Dark Souls, were, in my opinion, never AAA games. The developers had to take many shortcuts there, and also did not deliver on all the stuff they were implementing there. Just think of Blighttown and how incredibly bad the performance there was on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 back in the day. We're talking about literally 10 FPS at the bottom of Blighttown. I played it on my PlayStation 3 unpatched a few years ago. It was a fascinating experience to see how bad it ran. Like, it was absolutely terrible. It's legendarily terrible. Further, no character, for example, in Dark Souls moves his lips when he's talking. Only one character is the exception, that is Andre of Astora. So the developers had to take little shortcuts here and there because their budget was not infinitely big back in the day. And they developed a game with a relatively big scope, so quite an ambitious project, and made it work because somehow they managed to nail certain elements of the game perfectly. Like, fight a Black Knight or normal Silver Knight in Dark Souls 1 and backstab it. And it just feels so satisfying, so right. The animation is right, the sound is right. It's also so iconic when you hear it and see it happening. And then when the enemy is dead, you can just walk over it and you have funny ragdoll physics. So in the case of the Silver Knight and the Black Knights, they just vanish completely. But with many other enemies, that is the case. And I don't know what it is, what the secret ingredient of FromSoft is to make this so good. When the NPCs are talking, their lips don't move, but when the swords do the talking, the animation work and the sound design and so on is just perfect. And that, I think, is a big secret, because the combat in Souls is just very satisfying. And I have to admit that Lords of the Fallen from 2023 also does impressive animation work. Like, I feel walking around feels really good, rolling feels really good, dashing feels often very good, and also hitting the enemy looks good. I've seen definitely worse installments than this here. I read online that some people perceive the combat as floaty, but that is not my impression of the game so far. I feel like this is actually very decent, but still not on the same level as what FromSoft is doing. And now FromSoft, so many years later, like over a decade later, is a much bigger company, and Elden Ring is definitely a AAA game by now, and had a large budget and also an immense scope, and was also a very big success. They even managed to tackle in a very impressive way the concept of open world, which was also perceived by a lot of people very positively. And this here is now the approach of a smaller studio, just doing something similar. So of course I did not expect that this would surpass Elden Ring in any shape or form, or some of the other FromSoft games. But even comparing it to the early FromSoft games, I feel like it's impressive to see that they can't fully do it. Though, maybe if this game is successful enough and they get another shot at making a Soulslike, maybe as a sequel or a completely new game or whatever they decide to do with this, then they might be able to get closer to what FromSoft is doing, and that would be pretty great. That means more good games for us, I guess. However, outside of this now deeply discussed perfection here, there are also some unfortunately stupid game design decisions in this game that were completely avoidable and are completely unnecessary and hold the game back in the realms of fun, which is very unfortunate. A small example for this are elevators. Sometimes when you have to go to a boss, there are elevators on the way you have to use. And there's one boss in the game where you have to actually use 2 elevators. In Dark Souls, you would often use a technique. You activate the elevator by stepping on the pressure plate and then roll out of it to send it back up, so when you die to the boss, you don't have to call the elevator and wait for it. In this game, for whatever reason, they decided to add a little door to these elevators which closes at the speed of light, so you can't roll out and are trapped. As a result, you can't send the elevator back up. I think in Lies of P, it's even, the elevators are smart and they are always where you spawn and are automatically there, so you don't have to wait for them. In this game, it's unfortunately not the case. You have to call every elevator, wait for it, step into it, go down, and when you have 2 elevators on the way, you almost want to deinstall the game, because we have seen this solved better in other games already. Can we please not add annoying problems or elements to the game that weren't even a problem in Demon Souls from 2009? Thank you. Like, they were inspired by so many elements in the previous Souls games, and this they decided to add to the game because they were thinking, yeah, that makes the game completely better. No, it does not. I briefly asked the question, what makes a Soulslike a Soulslike? And in my opinion, that is not too well defined, but there are definitely some core elements that must be inside a game. One would be, in my opinion at least, that you lose in some form something on death, but you also have the option to kind of get this back, at least one time, and this creates some tension. The classic implementation is you have your experience points, souls, blood echoes, or whatever they are called in your game, and when you die, you lose those unspent experience points. Those you spent already, of course, the levels you already made you keep. And then you have one chance to go back where you died and pick those experience points, those souls, back up. And then you got them back. But if you die on the way, they are gone. This is also in Lord of the Fallen, so there should be very little discussion, in my opinion, if it's a Souls-like or not. It clearly has the inspiration from soft Souls games. In Sekiro, for example, you also can lose something on death, not always. So even there, a very different implementation of that is in place, though I would also say Sekiro is not a real Souls-like in a sense, it's just its own thing in many ways. But it can't be denied that it is also kind of related to the Souls series. Another classic core mechanic is that there are these checkpoints in the world that exist as physical objects where you can rest. If you do so, all enemies respawn that you have killed, except for already defeated bosses and some mini-bosses or special enemies. In Dark Souls they are called bonfires, but they have all kinds of other names in other games, of course. Further, they also refill your healing items, or some of your healing items, a special one that you will mainly use in the game. And these two core mechanics, the death mechanic and the bonfire and healing mechanic, have a very big impact on how the game works, because the game in of itself is also often quite difficult. So you have to take even some trash mobs in the world serious, and sometimes the level design and the world design is also a bit mean, so dying is at a very high probability if you explore the game for the first time. On top of that, you have some mini-bosses and special enemies that are sometimes just placed as a roadblock for you, and you have to kind of find out a way to deal with those. Especially a boss fight that you can stumble in, and then those boss fights suddenly turn out to be very difficult. Exploring is of course also a very big part in the classic Souls games. And this also generates this interesting loop of you have to make the decision. I run out of healing items, I still have a bit of HP left. Should I go on and try to find the next checkpoint, the next bonfire? Or should I take my progress, go back to the bonfire, spend it so I can't lose it anymore, and replay the passage? This time more clever, maybe more skilled, now knowing the dangers of the passage and having maybe some tactic developed that helps you to get through it easier. And in an ideal scenario, and FromSoft is in their best games or best level sections in their best games really good at this, you notice already on your way back, oh, over there I overlooked something. There's an item I didn't see. How do I get there? Maybe there's a secret wall or something here somewhere, a secret passage I have not found. And maybe you also notice when you go to the bonfire that something changed. Maybe there's now an NPC standing there all of a sudden, and this gives you always a sense of, oh, there's something new, I learned something, oh, I found something new, good that I went back. Sometimes you also find nothing, but at times you do, and this gives a really cool dynamic of exploration, finding something new and feeling rewarded doing so. It's already feeling very rewarding if you had a lot of trouble with a passage and then try it a few times, and then it suddenly becomes almost easy and you just blitz through it and it's no problem anymore and you get better at the game. That feels awesome. And I think these are at least the core mechanic. There are many other nuances and also further details and sub-mechanics that are in FromSoft games very present and you could argue should belong here as well, but I don't want to make the video too long. So this is, at least in my opinion, the core of Souls. And all of that is present in Lords of the Fallen. To finally come back to the game I'm actually reviewing, Lords of the Fallen adds another layer to this, another concept, their own little twist to this that not many games do, but we have seen, of course, in some other games as well. And that is, they use a dual world concept. So there is the, let's call it physical world, which is called, I think, Axiom, and there is a nightmarish or mysterious blue version of the world that is like the parallel dimension version of this world, and that is called the Umbrell World or Umbrell. You can switch from the physical world to the Umbrell World at any time, but you can't switch instantly back to the physical world. Only at certain points in a level you can do this, or at resting points you can do this as well. And they play a little bit around with it, that for example, in the Umbrell World, the door is not there, but in the physical world there is a door. So you need to switch to the Umbrell World to get through the door. You have also the lantern in this game, and with this you can look into the Umbrell World, and also the light of this lantern already turns the world to the Umbrell World. So you can use the lantern to actually walk through this door. But if you want to interact with stuff in the Umbrell World, you usually have to switch to that completely. And this is very interesting and also technically very impressive and works very well in my opinion. This adds the problem to the game that you have to learn the other world. So some stuff only exists in one world and the other, and you have to find the path. It can get kind of confusing. I think Lords of the Fallen is not that good as, for example, the FromSoft Souls games to get you an idea where you currently are in a level or in the world. At the beginning it's absolutely okay, but I stumbled into some later sections of the game by now and noticed, well, I kind of get lost here and have trouble finding my way. There are too many passages, all look kind of the same. That is a problem. And on top of that, you can switch to the blue version of the world, to the Umbrell World, and then stuff is also different there. You have different passages. Suddenly there's a bridge where there wasn't a bridge before. Sometimes you have completely new structures that you don't see in the physical world in Axiom. And then it gets even more confusing. That's a little problem. Though you iterate through the world and kind of learn the level, as in the Souls games, to kind of almost perfection at some point, if you play a lot of Souls. In this game, I had an incredible hard time sometimes to do the same, because you have to learn 2 levels at once, if that makes sense, and that is a bit annoying. Further, and I mentioned these roadblocks, these special enemies, sometimes some big knight with red glowing eyes that is in your way and you need to get past this guy. Sometimes it's very tense, like you only have like 1 healing left, you have to play very carefully, and it creates these intense moments, and when you get over them, you just feel great. If you get destroyed, you just are very sad. And also those roadblock enemies exist in Lords of the Fallen. Unfortunately, if you fight them in the Umbrell World, you have the problem that consistently little annoying enemies spawn. And those water down those scenarios a little bit, or make them more annoying. To the point where I've often felt like, well, I could just, instead of fighting this guy 1v1 in a battle to the death in a tense moment, I just run past him so I don't have to deal with him and his 20 friends that will spawn. 20 is an exaggeration here. It's maybe like 1 or 3 little guys. And they can become really numerous, to be honest. Like, actually like 10 or 12 enemies if you wait too long, because they literally respawn indefinitely as long as you are in the Umbrell World, and I assume on a certain timer depending on the level section. Further, they are very simple enemies, but if there are 3 and you fight a big guy in between, they just become annoying. They're not interesting to fight though in of itself. It's just literally trash mobs that spawn indefinitely in your way. And at the beginning I found this okay, but the longer I played, the more annoying I found this particular mechanic, because sometimes you have to be in the Umbrell World. But you can imagine how this can get annoying in these tense moments and get a little bit in the way. I understand that they want to make the Umbrell World a more dangerous version of the real world, of the physical world, or whatever you want to call it, and also with this mechanic that after a time a phantom spawns and just chases you and is really annoying to deal with. So you want to not stay too long in the Umbrell World, and this creates some kind of urgency, and I completely understand this approach to their Umbrell World. And as a reward you get more experience, more souls if you want, in the Umbrell World as well. So you kind of have an incentive to stay there. Sometimes you need to go to the Umbrell World, else you can't progress, because, like I said, a bridge or something is only existing in the other version of the world. And that's kind of cool, but sometimes for these classic Souls moments, it's in the way. I often don't want to be that much in the Umbrell World, to be honest. I think a simple solution to this could be like an item that is not a consumable that you use, and then in a certain generous radius for like a minute or two prevents all these Umbrell enemies from spawning there randomly. And you can just stay in this radius and have your Souls moment, and you don't have to worry about other enemies. And then it goes on cooldown for some time, and you have to kind of think, when do I want to use this item and when not. That would be, in my opinion, an interesting solution that also gives you a decision. Though, of course, in theory, it could be just an illusion of a decision, because when you want to duel a tough enemy, you always use the item, and when it's always off cooldown, because it's too low or something, it is not a real decision, you just use it. It's just a thought of mine. You maybe have to look deeper into this from a game design perspective, but there are definitely, in my opinion, possibilities to solve this issue. Another issue I found with the Umbrell World, it also kind of ruins the beautiful vista of the game, because suddenly everything becomes this blue nightmarish version. And of course it looks cool at the beginning, but the style or the art style of this Umbrell World is, at least so far in the game, always pretty much the same. So the physical world changes, and you are in some dark caves, and you have like this beautiful forest vista and some old ruins or whatever. You switch to the Umbrell World and the same blue nightmarish thing as always. So this also kind of works against all their efforts to make a really beautiful looking game. And Lords of the Fallen really looks good. It's not a joke. It's definitely a good looking game, and it shows what the Unreal Engine 5 can do. So it's interesting to see how they water down this effort with this kind of mechanic. But don't get me wrong, it's not a complete deal breaker. It's just interesting to see that this dual world mechanic, which in my opinion is technically impressive and also on paper a very interesting mechanic, but at the same time it can also in some places be in the way of what they, I think, try to achieve with the game. There's also another mechanic that kind of adds to the intensity of the Umbrell World, and it's, I guess, inspired by Sekiro. When you die in the physical world, you are not instantly dead, but you get a second life and awake in the Umbrell World. Only when you die in the Umbrell World, you respawn, which, in my opinion, is actually a pretty cool mechanic, because you always have this safety buffer. Even if you jump down a cliff to your death, you awake on top of the cliff in the Umbrell World. But as soon as you die in the Umbrell World, you respawn at the bonfire, and the enemies and so on are back. So this makes always like being in the physical world more relaxing, and in the Umbrell World it just becomes more stressful, because now you have no room for mistake. And that's, I think, pretty cool, because the world in this game can be very deadly. Further, you also have this grey health mechanic that we kind of know from Street Fighter actually. Here it works a bit different though. So if you awake in the Umbrell World, your HP are kind of half red and half white. And if you get hit, the white part vanishes completely. However, if you hit enemies, you slowly refill the white bar till everything is red again. So it's a bit like in Bloodborne, where when you get hit, you can hit the enemy a few times and get some HP back. It's somewhat similar than this, only that the white bar just doesn't really move on its own. So not everything with the Umbrell World is annoying and terrible. I think actually it has some cool and interesting mechanics. I really like the idea of it as well. I just think that in some parts it clashes with other parts of the game, and here it just gets too annoying at times. For me, it also felt that the developers sometimes placed too many enemies in a level or in a certain section or area of a level, and you look at all these enemies and think, oh boy, I don't want to fight all of them, this takes forever, and then I do one mistake, die and have to do it again. That's not fun. Like, it's not Diablo where you just kill hordes of enemies. It's a Soulslike, and you need quality over quantity often. Sometimes, of course, you can place like a little horde of weak enemies and so on, but I felt like they overdid this here a few times. Also, some of the level design decisions and so on are relatively mean and feel a bit unfair, sometimes even cheap, so that is also a problem. Another thing I noticed is that some enemies seem to repeat in the game too often. So you have one guy who shoots a fireball, and there's another guy in another section of the level, he shoots a poison ball, and another one shoots like, I don't know, something like lightning. And it's the same enemy, it's just a different element, and this feels like, okay, I've seen these kind of enemies a few times too often now. Though you could argue Elden Ring also does it in many ways, but there the enemy variety, if you just look at the whole game, is just so big that you can't complain that they also have like the same enemy in green or red in the game again. That is kind of excusable there. Here though, after like 10-15 hours, noticing this already is a bit unfortunate, I think. Another detail I find very fascinating is the camera in this game. FromSoft games always have a trash camera. I think we don't have to pretend like the Souls camera is great. I wouldn't say the camera in Lords of the Fallen is worse, but it does some things better, but others worse than the Souls camera, and this is kind of strange to me. For example, the lock-on system, at least on the release version of Lords of the Fallen, is complete trash and terrible, but some edge cases like fighting in corners feels actually a bit better, though it's never great to fight somebody close to a wall. But here I had less trouble than in the Souls games, and it felt like, yeah, I often have kind of a better overview. Not always, but sometimes, and that's at least something, right? But for example, when you position switch with a boss, like he attacks into the screen and you roll behind him, then sometimes the camera is too slow turning around the boss, and this feels really weird when you play it. You get used to it, to be honest, it's not that big of a deal, but I just was thinking, why is the camera moving so slow here? But when you switch between targets with a lock-on system, the camera can suddenly move with the speed of light, and it feels too fast, even faster than it is in Souls. But all this sounds so negative, and I don't mean it. I think the game is actually decent. I would almost call it good. It just has a few issues that holds it back. Some can maybe be fixed and patched in theory. Some maybe are a task for the next iteration, if there will ever be one. And I hope there will be one, to be honest. Though keep in mind that I haven't completed the game yet, and I read already that the game kind of breaks a bit more and more, and the issues become more and more clear in the late game. So I'm very curious what I have to expect there. The game also ran pretty well on my system, though a lot of people complained about performance issues, but maybe this time I got lucky and had no problems at all. It ran relatively stable at 80 FPS on my system at 4K resolution. I use a 3080, so no problem there, even on the release version. Though I can kind of see that the game, even at 4K, but it has no ray tracing options and so on, in theory should run a little bit better than this. So maybe even I should get, with DLSS on performance and some lower settings and so on, I should easily get 100, 120 FPS. I was not seeing that, so as a result I can see that maybe on a weaker system you definitely could get into trouble with this game, but for me it worked out completely fine and I had no problems there. Exploration in the game, I found a lot of fun so far, for the most part. Of course, some elements could have been realized better. Sometimes the level design is not 100% on point. There were some areas that had, as mentioned, too many enemies, and then I said, okay, I don't want to explore this because this would mean I have to fight everyone. I don't want this. So there's definitely some room for improvement, but overall I must say exploration feels rewarding. Returning to some old places and see if something changed also works. Sometimes I would wish that some NPCs would react more to changes in the world or to what I'm doing instead of giving me the same dialogue options all the time, but I guess that's a limitation of this project simply. Also, I really liked the soundtrack of the game. I think it's pretty nice, but you definitely notice that it might be inspired a bit by Dark Souls 3's soundtrack, so there is that. But we already discussed that the game has many inspirations from the FromSoft Souls games, so that is not really a surprise. There's also a Firelink shrine kind of in this game, and so on. You have so many similarities. But I also think Lords of the Fallen had a bit of bad luck for its release timing. Like Lies of P just came out a few weeks earlier and it seems they nailed it. I haven't played it yet and I will. But it's very unfortunate if another game in your subgenre comes out a few weeks earlier and kind of delivers, and then you come out, have some technical and performance issues on release. It's very unfortunate. This game would have come out like, I don't know, summer 2021, so before Elden Ring, I think reviews would have been a lot more generous with this game in comparison. But now we have the direct comparison to like Lies of P. And if you also have the same price tag, at least on PC, as Elden Ring, then potentially play Elden Ring if you haven't yet. It's a much better game and it's not even close. Of course, Elden Ring also has some annoying passages and its problems here and there, but overall, it's just a much more impressive game, I have to admit. If you have played all the other decent and good Souls games out there yet, then maybe check this game out. It could definitely be a fun time. I definitely have a good time so far with it, but don't expect the highest level possible. And when it comes to worst game release from a technical standpoint in 2023, Jedi Survivor still takes the crown, and that is a AAA title and not just a AA like this one here. But this video is already far too long, so as said at the beginning already, if you liked it, maybe press the like button. If you want more reviews and other game related stuff here, maybe also subscribe to this channel, would be much appreciated. I'm aiming for the 1000 subscribers, would be great to get those. Maybe leave me also a comment, tell me your experience with the game or if you're interested in it or not. Would be much appreciated. I hope this was in any shape or form remotely useful to somebody at least, and I wish you a fantastic rest of the day and see you people next time. Goodbye.